I tend to think we have been a little bit overly risk averse, especially when it came to the tanks. And now I think the next decisions will be important as well. At some point, we have to give the Ukrainians a longer range precision munition for the HIMARS, the high mobility artillery rocket system. The one that they have right now, the guided missile launch rocket system, is accurate to about 80 kilometers, very accurate, land on a dinner table at that distance. And it has proven that was one of the game changer weapons that enabled the Ukrainians to take out Russian headquarters, fuel depots, ammo storage sites, barracks, and so forth, and really forced the Russians to withdraw their forces that were west of the Dnipro River. They just no longer could sustain them once the Ukrainians had made it impossible for the Russians to support them. You'll see something like that similar, but they really need a longer range system. And if we get into the question of Crimea at some point in time and trying to isolate it, that's where you'd need a longer range as well. There are two options. The one that's most well known is the Army Tactical Missile System, accurate to about 300 kilometers. And then there's an intermediate one called the small diameter bomb, which can be adapted to be shot from HIMARS and available in quite large quantities and also relatively cheap. It's much less actually than either the guided missile launch rocket system or ATACMS. So that's another one. And at some point, I think F-16s probably are going to begin to be discussed. And I don't think, again, David, that Russia wants to pick a fight with a NATO country. I think that they have recognized that use of tactical nuclear weapons would backfire on them. So I'm not sure what their options are. They make these threats, but in every case, they have proven to be empty. And I think that that will continue to be the case. To the question, where is Crimea in that? I'm so hesitant actually to ever suggest that there again might be some kind of territorial concession after the extraordinary sacrifices that Ukraine has made. And I don't want to imply that, I expect that they can take it or actually cannot. I think this is an open question. Here's the scenario. If they can, in the spring-summer offensive this year, sever the ground link that Russia has, the ground bridge as it's called, that Russia has established that goes from Russia proper down into Ukraine. And so they block that. Then Russia is dependent on the Kerch Strait Bridge to keep Crimea resupplied. If you can take that down again, or part of it, of course, was knocked down earlier, and then force it to rely on ferries. And then if you can start taking them out. Now, these are very, very challenging actions and operations, but I put nothing. The Ukrainians have shown incredible innovativeness, initiative, skill. They're called the ultimate MacGyvers. They can make anything work. They can adapt a HARM missile from an F-16 and put it on a MiG-29 and so forth. If you can isolate Crimea fully, and if you then have the precision munitions with greater range and can start picking off the Black Sea Fleet headquarters, the various air bases, the various seaports, and all the rest of this, again, it is not inconceivable that you could sufficiently isolate it and then at some point in time, either go in on the ground or have some kind of concession in the other direction. So this is, I think, how you'd think about this, David. But again, so much of this is so dependent on that very first issue that we discussed, and that is the ability to generate additional forces and capabilities in the next few months. And then it depends on decisions that I'm sure are being discussed right now in Western capitals, and especially in Washington, when it comes to the additional capabilities that I've described. I'd also add advanced drones here because they can be incredibly important, as you well know, for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities, and possibly also for strike capabilities if you enable that as well. So that's just sort of thinking our way through both the end game and how Crimea might or might not fit into it. Battle lines have been essentially static. The Russians have been doing more offensive operations than have the Ukrainians for the last several months, but not really achieving all that much. And what they have been achieving has been very, very costly. So I think the big question right now is whether or not the Ukrainians can do once again what they did earlier in the war, which is to do better than Russia in force generation. In other words, in recruiting, training, equipping, organizing, and employing additional forces. And of course, this is where the latest very important announcement comes in, the Western contribution of German Leopard 2 tanks, US M1 Abrams tanks, and also UK Challenger tanks, because that will be the last piece that they need to assemble combined arms capabilities. In other words, mechanized forces that include tanks, the centerpiece, infantry, engineers, artillery, close air support, air defense, explosive ordnance disposal, drones, all of this. And if they can put that together and once again outgenerate Russia in this force generation battle, then in a few months we'll see the Ukrainians able to resume counteroffensive operations and to try to liberate more of their territory of that which is occupied by Russia. And in an ideal world, perhaps to sever the ground connection that Russia has achieved from Russia proper to Crimea. But again, this depends on how each side does in force generation. We know that the Russians are going to mobilize further. They had a much vaunted mobilization of some supposedly 300,000 additional soldiers last year. Nobody knows how many actually showed up at the recruiting station. We do know that more left the country than did show up. But that's hundreds of thousands of additional forces. The problem for the Russians has been that they have not really conducted any meaningful training for these soldiers. Many of them are reservists. And they don't have the equipment for them at this stage either, because the export controls and other sanctions on Russia have taken a serious toll on the military-industrial complex of Russia, which is why, of course, the Iranian supplied drone have proved to be so important. So that's where we are right now, David. The question is, which side can generate more forces and more capable forces? Last year, the Ukrainians did that far better than did the Russians, helped enormously, of course, by the U.S. and other countries' provision of arms, ammunition, and other assistance. And we'll see if that plays out again this year. That would be my prediction, but it's going to take time to bring in these new weapon systems, the tanks, to put them together with the other capabilities that are required for combined arms operations, and then to position them, get the logistics set, and launch what will be probably a spring or late spring, early summer counteroffensive. Frankly, what they need to do is perform tasks that they should have been doing, 5 and 10 years ago. They need to conduct really rigorous training. What's a mystery to me, David, is that they had months during which they were assembled on the borders of Ukraine in Belarus and Russia. And as far as I can tell, they did nothing in the way of training. If you'd given us, our commanders, months, we'd train that force to a razor's edge. And they did not. And we saw the results of that.